In this gripping story, Mayor Marie Walker, a successful and respected black woman, is unjustly arrested by Officer Kirkland while jogging in her own town. Despite her authority as mayor, the officer accuses her of breaking the law and treats her with blatant disrespect, demonstrating his racist biases. The situation escalates as the officer refuses to acknowledge her identity, subjecting her to public humiliation. This wrongful arrest reveals deep-seated racial prejudices within the system, sparking outrage and forcing Marie to confront the systemic racism that still prevails in her community. The glass doors of the small coffee shop swung open, and a quiet bell jingled as Xavier Shaw stepped inside. It was the sort of place most people wouldn't expect a man like him to frequent. Small, with mismatched chairs and local art hanging on the walls, a world away from the sleek conference rooms and high-rise offices that defined his day-to-day life. But Xavier liked it here, liked the anonymity it provided. The barista, a young woman with a nose ring and tattoos of what looked like quotes from old poets, greeted him with a smile that was friendly but not overly familiar. "Hey, what can I get you today?" she asked, pulling her apron a little tighter around her waist. Xavier's smile was genuine as he stepped up to the counter. "Just a black coffee, thanks," he replied, his voice steady, clear, a reflection of the calm composure he had cultivated over the years. He was wearing a simple navy blue hoodie, jeans and sneakers. Nothing that screamed wealth or power. Nothing that screamed CEO of Shaw Enterprises, the massive global tech company he had built from the ground up. Nothing that signaled he was one of the most influential black men in the city. It wasn't about hiding who he was. Xavier was proud of his success. But this coffee shop, this quiet place, gave him space to remember where he came from. To be human for a moment, not just a figure on a magazine cover. As the barista rang him up, a couple at the nearby table glanced his way, whispering to each other. Their eyes were trained on him. Those quick, almost dismissive glances that Xavier had come to know well. He had been the subject of more whispered conversations in public spaces than he could count. And though he was used to it, it still irritated him. Especially in places like this, where people assumed the man in the hoodie couldn't possibly be the man who had built an empire. When his coffee was handed over, Xavier took the cup without a word of small talk. He wasn't in the mood today. Instead, he nodded and made his way toward a quiet corner of the shop, where he could sit and think for a while. The faint hum of conversation mixed with the steady whir of the espresso machine as he took a seat by the window. His eyes flickered briefly to the people passing by on the sidewalk, but his thoughts remained inward, on the meeting he'd had earlier that morning with a local politician, a meeting that had only confirmed what he already knew. The social climate of this city was changing, but not for the better. The inequalities that had always lurked beneath the surface were now more evident than ever. For all the success of his company, for all the charity work and community outreach he was involved in, Xavier knew he was still seen, by many, as an outsider. As a black man, no matter how far he had come, there would always be people who saw him first for his skin color, and second, maybe, for what he had achieved. He leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of his coffee as he looked out at the street. He had always believed that hard work and perseverance could change the world, and to a degree, he had proven that belief right. But as he had climbed the ladder of success, he'd also seen how often society tried to pull him back down, whether it was the subtle remarks from people who didn't believe he belonged in certain rooms, or the more blatant acts of discrimination he faced in business and personal spaces. It was exhausting, and yet, he couldn't afford to stop. The work had only just begun. His phone buzzed, breaking his reverie. Xavier glanced at the screen to see a text message from his assistant, Aisha. "There's a situation at the office, something you might want to handle personally. Let me know when you're on your way." Xavier frowned, his fingers lingering over the phone before he replied. "I'm on my way." He took another sip of his coffee and stood up, grabbing his hoodie and slinging it over his shoulder as he walked out of the coffee shop. The cool air hit him immediately as he stepped outside, a stark contrast to the warmth of the shop. A few blocks down, the office loomed in the distance, but as Xavier began to walk, his steps quickening with the anticipation of what awaited him, his mind wandered back to the larger issue at hand. The battle that was brewing, not just in his company, but in the city itself. Xavier's rise to power had never been an easy one. He had grown up in a modest neighborhood, in a family that struggled to make ends meet. It was only through an unwavering drive, a sharp intellect, and an indomitable will to prove himself that he had broken through the barriers that had kept so many like him from success. He had built Shaw Enterprises with the same grit that had carried him through his childhood, but now that success had become its own challenge. He was a black man in a world that had always been predominantly white and affluent, and though he had earned his place, there were still those who believed he didn't deserve it. People who made assumptions based on how he looked or where he was from. People who still couldn't see past their prejudices. They saw him as a threat, not because of his accomplishments, but because of his very presence in spaces that had never been meant for someone like him. As he approached the glass doors of Shaw Enterprises, Xavier straightened up, shifting into the role that so many saw him as: powerful, influential, a man with authority. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. The receptionist, a young woman in her early 20s, looked up from her desk, her face neutral, but her eyes flickered with recognition. "Good afternoon, Mr. Shaw," she greeted him, standing up and reaching for the phone. Xavier nodded politely, but he didn't stop to engage. His assistant, Aisha, was waiting for him in the elevator lobby, her expression tense. "There's been an issue with one of the new hires," Aisha said, her tone clipped. "I think you should see it for yourself. It's complicated." Xavier followed her, as she led him through the glass doors into the sleek, modern office that defined Shaw Enterprises. The conference room, as usual, was filled with the quiet buzz of employees at work, typing away on their computers or consulting with one another in hushed tones. It was a stark contrast to what Aisha had just hinted at, and the unease in her voice was more unsettling than he expected. Aisha led him down a hallway, past glass-walled offices, before stopping at a room near the back of the building. Inside, a few junior employees were gathered, looking awkward and uncertain. At the center of the room was a man, a new hire, who was visibly upset. "Xavier," Aisha said, her voice dropping low, "this is Marcus. He just received an email with a blatant racial slur in it, apparently from one of the senior managers." Xavier's jaw tightened, his chest constricting as he stepped forward. He didn't know the full details yet, but the tension was clear. "Marcus, I'm Xavier Shaw," he said, extending a hand. "I'm the CEO of this company. I want to make sure you feel heard." Marcus, a young black man in his mid-20s, took his hand cautiously, but his eyes were filled with frustration and disbelief. "It's not just the slur, sir," Marcus replied, his voice tight. "It's the fact that it came from someone in the position they're in. It's the way it was dismissed, like it was nothing." Xavier nodded, his mind already processing the situation. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was the type of systemic racism that had long been allowed to fester in the corporate world. It wasn't just about one individual. It was about the culture that allowed that behavior to persist unchecked. "Let's get to the bottom of this," Xavier said, his voice steady but firm. "I want to know who sent it, and why they thought it was acceptable, and I want it handled appropriately. No one in this company should have to deal with this." As Marcus nodded in agreement, Xavier turned to Aisha, his eyes meeting hers with an unspoken understanding. He had spent years building this company to be a place of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But this incident, this blatant act of racism, reminded him that no matter how much progress was made, the work was never truly finished. Xavier knew that today would be the start of something. A battle that would force him to confront not just his company's practices, but the deep-seated prejudices in the very fabric of society. He had spent years carving out a place for himself in a world that wasn't built for him, but now, it seemed, he was being forced to fight a much larger battle, one that wasn't just about his success, but about the future of the world he was trying to change. Xavier Shaw's mind raced as he sat down in his office chair, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on him. His assistant, Aisha, sat across from him, her eyes tired but determined, as she recounted the details of the email Marcus had received. The racial slur, along with a dismissive comment about Marcus's performance, had been sent from none other than a senior manager in the company. "How did we miss this?" Xavier asked, his voice calm, but the edge of frustration was evident. "We didn't," Aisha replied. "It wasn't the first time something like this happened. This is just the first time it's been so blatantly obvious." Xavier ran his fingers over the smooth surface of his desk, a habit he had when he was trying to collect his thoughts. This wasn't just about one email or one employee's experience. This was a systemic problem that reached deeper than a single act of ignorance. He had built Shaw Enterprises on the foundation of inclusivity and respect. But this situation, the toxic undercurrent of racism and prejudice within his own company, was a crack he couldn't ignore. The realization settled over him like a cold wave. No matter how much success he had achieved, no matter how much he had done for his community, there were still people who believed his mere presence in the room was a threat. People who, because of his skin color, didn't believe he belonged in spaces of power, even though he had earned every inch of that space. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Xavier said, his tone steady, despite the rising frustration that churned inside him. Aisha's assistant, Marcus, entered the room hesitantly, his face tense with both anger and disappointment. He was young, maybe in his mid-20s, with a strong build that spoke of athletic discipline. Xavier had known him for several months, but he saw something different in him now. It wasn't just the hurt in his eyes, it was the weight of knowing that even here, in the very place he worked to build, he was still considered less than. "Marcus, sit down," Xavier said, gesturing to the chair next to his desk. Marcus hesitated, then nodded and sat. "I know this is difficult," Xavier continued, his voice soft but resolute. "But we're going to address this. We'll find out who sent that email, and we'll make sure there's accountability." Marcus met Xavier's gaze, his eyes briefly filled with a storm of emotions. Anger, hurt, and something deeper, something that looked like betrayal. But he nodded. "I appreciate that, sir. It's just hard. You'd think, after everything, things would be different. That I wouldn't have to face this kind of thing here." Xavier felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had faced it all before. The microaggressions, the subtle slights that chipped away at his confidence, his sense of belonging. But he had learned to stay composed, to rise above it. He had fought for a seat at the table, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that from him. Not without a fight. "I know, Marcus," Xavier said quietly. "Believe me, I do. But this company is not just a business to me, it's a legacy. And if we want it to mean something, we need to make sure it reflects the values we say we stand for." Marcus leaned forward, his voice low, but filled with a quiet conviction. "It's not just about the company, Mr. Shaw. It's about everyone else, too. What about the people who can't do what you're doing? What about the ones who are still stuck, still fighting for something they deserve, but can't even get a foot in the door?" Xavier paused, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. He had built his success on the belief that anyone, regardless of race or background, could rise to the top if they were willing to put in the work. But as he looked at Marcus now, he couldn't ignore the harsh truth. Not everyone had the same opportunities, and not everyone was given a fair shot. "You're right," Xavier said softly, his gaze never leaving Marcus's. "And that's why we need to keep pushing. Not just for us, but for everyone who's been left behind." Marcus gave a brief nod, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. But Xavier could tell that this was just the beginning. There would be more to come, more obstacles to face. The fight for justice, for real change, wouldn't be easy. And now, with this new revelation within his own company, it felt more urgent than ever. Later that afternoon, Xavier stood outside his office, looking down at the bustling city below. Shaw Enterprises was one of the largest tech companies in the world, a leader in innovation and cutting-edge solutions. But beneath the surface of that success, there were still problems that had festered for far too long. The kind of problems that weren't just about products or profits, but about how people were treated. He checked his watch, aware that his next meeting was rapidly approaching. But before he could step away, he felt a tap on his shoulder. "Aisha," he said, turning to face her. "There's something you need to see," Aisha said, her voice quiet. "A video has gone viral. It's from this morning about Marcus." Xavier's stomach dropped. "What's happened?" Aisha didn't answer, only handed him her phone. He glanced at the screen, watching as a recording of Marcus's conversation with the senior manager, who had sent the racial slur, played. In the video, Marcus was visibly upset, his voice shaking as he confronted the manager. But the manager, a man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair, just smirked and shrugged, as if it was no big deal. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking," the manager said, his words dripping with condescension. The video ended there, but it didn't need to go further. Xavier's fists clenched as he watched, his anger growing. How had this manager been allowed to behave like this? How had he been allowed to poison the culture of Shaw Enterprises with his ignorance and bigotry? "This isn't just a bad situation anymore," Xavier said, his voice low and filled with resolve. "This is a public matter." Aisha nodded. "The video's already spreading like wildfire, and there's already been backlash online. People are calling it out for what it is: racial discrimination." Xavier took a deep breath. His mind was racing, but he knew what needed to be done. This wasn't just about protecting his company's reputation anymore. It was about protecting the dignity of every person who worked there. It was about standing up against the very culture of prejudice that had festered unchecked for too long. "We're going to handle this," Xavier said, his voice steady now. "We'll get an independent investigation started. We'll make sure the whole company knows that we're not tolerating this, not now, not ever." As he walked toward the elevator, Aisha following close behind, Xavier couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. He had built Shaw Enterprises from the ground up, and he was proud of everything it had achieved. But this moment was different. This wasn't just a matter of business or profits, this was a fight for justice, a fight that had been long overdue. He was ready for it, but he also knew it would take everything he had to turn the tide. There were still those in his company, and in his city, who would resist this change, those who would use their privilege to try and silence him. But Xavier Shaw had never been afraid of a fight. And this fight, for equality, for justice, was one he would win. Xavier Shaw paced the length of his office, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his chest. Aisha had left him alone for a moment, offering him the space to think, but his mind was already running 100 miles an hour. The video of Marcus's confrontation with the senior manager had gone viral, and the outrage had begun to spread. The damage was no longer contained to the private walls of Shaw Enterprises. It was out there, for the world to see. His company was under fire, and so was he. But it wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about the systemic issues that had reared their ugly heads, issues that had been buried beneath the surface for far too long. He could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. The world was watching, waiting for him to make a move. The truth was, he had been prepared for this moment for years. He had built his business and his success with a sense of purpose, with the belief that anyone, regardless of race, could rise to the top. But he had also learned that the world didn't always work like that, not when prejudice and bias were woven so deeply into the fabric of society. The first call had come just an hour ago, from the press. They wanted a statement. They wanted to know how Shaw Enterprises would respond to the video, to the accusations of discrimination. And Xavier had known the answer before they even asked. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide behind corporate PR spin. He was going to stand up, face the truth, and take action. But that would come later. First, there was the issue of how to handle the senior manager. The video had clearly captured his dismissive attitude towards Marcus, but the manager had issued a statement claiming it was all a misunderstanding, a miscommunication. It was a classic deflection, and Xavier could already hear the whispers behind the scenes. Those who would try to downplay it, to make it seem like just another isolated incident. Xavier's mind flickered to his own experience, all the times he had been underestimated, belittled, or disregarded because of his race. Even now, at the height of his success, there were people who still didn't think he belonged in the same room as them. People who thought they could dismiss him, treat him like a token, or an outsider. This situation, this video, it was just another painful reminder that things hadn't changed as much as he'd hoped. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Mitchell, one of his allies within Shaw Enterprises. Xavier glanced at the message, reading it quickly. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this under wraps. The board's already talking about damage control, and they're nervous. They want to know what your plan is." Xavier's jaw clenched. The board was already focusing on their reputation, on saving face, instead of addressing the real issue. The reality of what was happening was starting to sink in. This wasn't just about a single manager or a single employee, it was about the entire culture of the company. The deeper systemic issues that had been ignored for so long. And Xavier, as much as he wanted to protect his company, knew that the time had come to deal with those issues head-on. He sat back in his chair, staring at the screen for a moment, then quickly typed a response. "Tell them to get ready. This isn't just a PR crisis, it's a call for real change. I won't back down." The message sent. Xavier leaned back in his chair, his mind steely with resolve. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, a mixture of anger and determination. The pressure was mounting, and he could sense the growing rift between those who wanted to preserve the status quo and those like him who wanted to disrupt it. It was just after noon when Xavier arrived at the company headquarters. He had already heard murmurs about the board meeting scheduled for later that afternoon, and he knew it wasn't going to be easy. The company was under scrutiny, and the last thing he needed was for the conversation to veer into damage control rather than genuine reform. As he stepped into the lobby, he was greeted by familiar faces, employees who had worked with him for years. Some of them smiled and nodded, while others looked away, their expressions uncertain. It was in those moments that Xavier felt the weight of his responsibility more than ever. He wasn't just leading a company, he was leading a movement, a transformation, in a place that had long been resistant to change. "Mr. Shaw, sir," a voice called out. Xavier turned to see one of the senior managers, a middle-aged white man with graying hair and a crisp suit. It was Thomas Harris, one of the people who had been with the company since its early days. "Thomas," Xavier said, his tone polite but distant, "how's everything going?" Harris shifted uncomfortably. "We need to talk about the video. The board's concerned, and there's a lot of pressure to handle it carefully. They're talking about issuing a statement to the press to make sure we stay on top of this." Xavier's gaze hardened. "I'm not interested in issuing a statement to downplay what happened. I'm not going to sweep this under the rug. We need to address this issue head-on." Harris looked taken aback. "But sir, you have to understand the stakes. We can't afford to alienate our partners, our clients. The board wants to make sure that we handle this with caution. We don't want to lose any more business." Xavier's patience began to fray. "This isn't about business, Thomas. It's about integrity. If we're not willing to stand up for what's right now, then everything we've built is meaningless. I'm not playing their game, not anymore." Thomas hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. Xavier could feel the tension in the air, the pressure to conform, to protect the company's image above all else. But that was no longer his priority. His priority was justice, and he wasn't going to let anyone divert him from that path. As he walked past Thomas, Xavier's thoughts turned to the next step, meeting with the board. He knew that some of them would fight him every step of the way, try to diminish the gravity of the situation, make excuses for the senior manager's actions. But Xavier was done being patient. It was time to make them face the truth. The boardroom was silent when Xavier entered, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. The long, polished table was filled with his colleagues, some familiar faces, others newer additions to Shaw Enterprises. They all looked at him, some with wariness, others with curiosity. Xavier wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter. "We've all seen the video. We all know what happened, and if you think this is just a misunderstanding, then you're mistaken." The tension in the room grew palpable. Mitchell, who sat near the head of the table, shifted uncomfortably. Xavier could see the hesitancy in his eyes, but he wasn't about to back down. "Not now." "Sir," another board member, Richard Blake, spoke up. "We all agree this situation needs to be addressed, but do we really need to go this far? I mean, calling for an independent investigation could create more problems. We have a reputation to uphold." "I don't care about our reputation if it's built on a lie," Xavier shot back. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about the culture we've allowed to fester for far too long. It's about the people we've overlooked, the people we've let down." The room fell silent as Xavier's words echoed through the space. There was no turning back now. He had made his stand, and he wasn't going to let anyone dismiss the situation or drag it out for political convenience. But as the room sat in stunned silence, Xavier knew that the true test was yet to come. There would be pushback, there would be resistance. And when the time came, he would have to make the hardest decision of his life. The boardroom remained tense after Xavier's sharp words echoed through the space. Silence hung in the air, like a storm waiting to break. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but more importantly, he felt the pressure to act. There was no turning back now. His resolve had solidified with every word he'd spoken. The system he had worked within for years, the very system that had helped build Shaw Enterprises, was broken, and Xavier knew that change wasn't just a matter of policy. It was personal. "I'm not asking for a vote on this," Xavier continued, his voice steady, despite the rising conflict in the room. "We're not going to brush this under the rug. The truth is out there, and it's time for us to face it. The people of this town, and this company, deserve better. We will do the right thing." He scanned the faces of the board members, some tight with concern, others skeptical. Richard Blake, a staunch conservative on the board, shifted in his chair, tapping his fingers against the table, an act of impatience, or perhaps disdain. His cold eyes met Xavier's, and there was no mistaking the opposition in his gaze. "You're pushing us too hard, Xavier," Richard said, his voice low but charged with irritation. "You've let your emotions get the better of you. This investigation, this grandstanding, could ruin us. You're jeopardizing the very foundation of Shaw Enterprises." Xavier's jaw tightened. He knew this wasn't just about the investigation, it was about everything Richard represented, the old guard. The people who would rather keep the status quo than challenge the system that had kept them comfortable for so long. But Xavier was done with silence. He had learned, over the years, that silence was complicity. And if this moment was going to change anything, he needed to be the one to change it. "I'm not emotional, Richard. I'm clear-headed," Xavier said, leaning forward. "And I'm telling you now, if we don't take this step, we risk everything. This town is changing. Shaw Enterprises is changing. Either we move forward, or we get left behind." The room was still, each person processing his words, but Xavier could sense that the momentum was shifting in his favor. Mitchell, seated to his right, glanced at him, a look of quiet support in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Xavier could feel his ally's faith in him. But the tension had only begun to build. As the conversation continued, Xavier knew the next phase would be the hardest. The room wasn't just filled with people, it was filled with resistance. People who, for all their success, weren't ready to confront their own complicity in perpetuating the systems of privilege and power that had plagued society for generations. Later that afternoon, Xavier stood before the crowd of reporters that had gathered outside Shaw Enterprises. His heart raced with every step. This wasn't just a press conference, it was a turning point. What he said now could change everything. The street outside the office had turned into a cacophony of flashing cameras and shouted questions. Xavier had faced press before, but this felt different. This time, he wasn't just answering questions, he was confronting an entire system of injustice that had been allowed to flourish under the guise of corporate success and benevolence. He stepped to the podium, the murmurs of the crowd dying down as he adjusted the microphone. His gaze swept over the sea of faces, but he didn't linger on them. He wasn't here to placate anyone. He was here to make his stand. "Good afternoon," Xavier began, his voice cutting through the murmur of anticipation. "I'm here today to address the viral video that's been circulating the last 24 hours. It shows the unfortunate incident involving one of our senior managers, and it has raised serious questions about our company, our values, and our practices. These questions are valid, and they deserve answers." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. "I want to be clear. What happened was wrong. It was unjust, and it will not be ignored. Shaw Enterprises has been built on the principle that everyone, regardless of their race, background, or identity, deserves respect. We will not allow anything less than that." A flurry of camera flashes went off as reporters scribbled down notes, some of them trying to break into the moment with their own questions. Xavier raised a hand, signaling for calm. He wasn't finished. "The video you saw is part of a larger problem. A problem that doesn't just affect this company, but every company, every institution, and every community. It's a problem we all must confront. It's a systemic issue that affects us all, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't." Xavier's words hung in the air, his mind whirling with the consequences. The crowd of reporters began to whisper among themselves, sensing the shift. Xavier's resolve had become contagious. "Today," he continued, "I am calling for an independent investigation into the practices at Shaw Enterprises. We will hold ourselves accountable. We will not hide behind public relations or corporate jargon. We will do the hard work necessary to rebuild the trust that has been broken. And that starts right now." The reporters reacted quickly, their pens racing across paper as they shouted questions, but Xavier's focus remained steady. He had made the statement. Now, there was no going back. The backlash was immediate. By the time Xavier had returned to his office, his phone was flooded with messages. Calls from the board, texts from his staff. News outlets bombarded him with requests for interviews and statements. The town's reaction was just as swift, a mix of support and outrage pouring in from all sides. But it wasn't just the public response that concerned Xavier, it was the internal pushback. The board members were already holding meetings to try and downplay the situation. Richard Blake was calling for an emergency session to discuss damage control. But Xavier wasn't interested in controlling the narrative. He was interested in change. Mitchell knocked on the door before entering, his face etched with concern. "You really stirred the pot with that one, man," Mitchell said, offering a tight smile. "But I think you did the right thing." Xavier leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "It's only the right thing if we actually follow through. I don't care about their discomfort. If we don't face this, if we don't do the hard work now, then what was the point of everything I've built?" Mitchell nodded, but Xavier could see the doubt in his eyes. His friend, like many others, didn't want to see the company torn apart, but Xavier couldn't ignore the reality. This was about more than just public relations. This was about ensuring that the future of Shaw Enterprises was truly diverse, inclusive, and accountable. That would require dismantling old ways of thinking, ways that had been woven into the company's culture for years. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Xavier didn't need to look up to know who it was. It was Richard Blake, as expected. "Xavier, we need to talk," Richard said, his voice tight with frustration as he entered the room. Xavier didn't wait for him to sit down. "I've said what I needed to say, Richard. There's no turning back now." "Don't be naive," Richard spat, his face reddening. "You've just made this whole situation worse. You've called for an independent investigation. You've made this a public spectacle. Do you even understand what you're risking?" "I understand perfectly well," Xavier said, his tone steady but firm. "But the question isn't what I'm risking. The question is, what is Shaw Enterprises willing to risk? The people are watching us now. They want change, and I'm not going to let you stand in the way of that." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Xavier was already standing, his resolve unwavering. "I'm not backing down, Richard. This company will do the right thing, and if you can't get behind that, then maybe it's time for you to reconsider your position." Xavier's words landed like a punch. Richard faltered, a brief look of shock crossing his face, before he composed himself. "You'll regret this," Richard muttered, his eyes narrowing. "We'll see," Xavier replied coolly. As Richard stormed out, Xavier felt a surge of adrenaline. The battle was only beginning. But as the door slammed shut behind him, Xavier couldn't shake the feeling that something far more dangerous was on the horizon. His phone buzzed again, and he quickly checked the message. It was from Aisha. "Xavier, I just heard, there's going to be a protest tomorrow outside Shaw Enterprises. I don't know if it'll be peaceful. You need to prepare yourself." His heart skipped a beat. A protest. This wasn't just about corporate culture anymore. This was about a reckoning. The world was watching, and Xavier knew that tomorrow would be a defining moment. The tension had reached its peak. There was no going back now. The protest outside Shaw Enterprises was everything Xavier had feared, and yet everything he had known it would be. The streets were packed with hundreds of people, their chants rising above the city like a storm on the horizon. Signs demanding justice for the wrongful arrest, banners calling for accountability, and a sea of voices all calling out for change. Xavier stood at the edge of the crowd, just out of view of the cameras that were documenting every move, trying to absorb the gravity of the moment. He knew this was no longer just about Shaw Enterprises, it was about everything. Aisha stood next to him, her eyes scanning the protesters, the energy in the air palpable. "This isn't just a protest. This is a reckoning," she said softly, her tone grim. Xavier nodded, swallowing the knot of anxiety that had lodged in his throat. "I know I've been expecting it, but it's still overwhelming. As the minutes passed, Xavier could hear the distant sounds of sirens approaching. He wasn't surprised. This had been building for days. The investigation had already sparked controversy, but now, with the protests outside, the entire town seemed to be on the brink of exploding. The police had been warned, the mayor had already made it clear that the force needed to be careful how it responded, but Xavier had a sinking feeling that Officer Kirkland wouldn't care about that. He would only care about maintaining control, about asserting dominance. Suddenly, the sound of boots crunching against gravel broke through his thoughts. Xavier turned, and there he was. Officer Kirkland, walking purposefully through the crowd with a few other officers trailing behind him, their eyes scanning the protesters like they were criminals. His smirk was enough to send a chill down Xavier's spine. Kirkland stopped just a few feet away from Xavier, blocking his path. The smug look on his face didn't fade as he stared down at him. "So, the mighty Xavier Shaw is out here with the protesters, huh? You must really care about your company's reputation." Xavier stood tall, his heart pounding. He wasn't about to let Kirkland intimidate him. "I care about justice, Officer Kirkland. I care about making this company a place where people aren't treated like criminals because of the color of their skin." Kirkland chuckled, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "Justice, huh? That's rich. The only thing I see here is a bunch of people causing trouble. You've stirred this up, Shaw, and now you're playing the hero. It's pathetic." Xavier's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel his anger rising, but he had to control it. His voice remained calm, but the words were sharp. "You think this is about me, about my reputation? No, Kirkland. This is about a system that has failed the people of this town for far too long, and it's about time we held you accountable for your actions." Kirkland's eyes flashed with anger. "Accountable for what? For doing my job. You're out here playing the victim, acting like your arrest was some kind of conspiracy. But it wasn't. You were in the wrong, just like every other person who thinks they're above the law. And you," he said, his finger pointing directly at Xavier, "you're no different." The crowd behind them had grown quieter, watching the confrontation unfold with bated breath. Xavier's mind raced, but he kept his gaze locked on Kirkland's, refusing to back down. The tension in the air was thick, as if the whole town was waiting for the match to ignite. "You're wrong, Kirkland," Xavier said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "You don't get to decide who's above the law. You don't get to decide who's guilty just because you don't like the way they look or who they are. The only thing that's happening here is that you're holding on to power you don't deserve, and I'm going to make sure you lose it." Kirkland's face contorted with fury, but Xavier could see the hint of uncertainty in his eyes. For the first time, it seemed like the officer wasn't entirely sure of himself. His pride, his authority, everything he had always relied on, was being challenged. He took a step forward, leaning into Xavier's personal space, but Xavier didn't flinch. "You think you can take me down, huh? You think you're going to make me the villain in your little story?" Kirkland sneered. "Let me tell you something, Shaw. No one cares about your little crusade. You're just a man with too much money and too much ego. You'll never be able to change this system." Xavier took a step closer, his chest rising and falling with the intensity of the moment. "I don't need to change the whole system on my own, Kirkland. But I'm not going to let people like you keep abusing it. This isn't just about one arrest. It's about a history of injustice that needs to be confronted. I'm not backing down, and neither are the people who stand behind me." Kirkland's jaw tightened. He stepped back, but only for a moment. Then he turned, gesturing to the officers behind him. "Fine," he spat. "We'll see who gets the last word." But Xavier wasn't done. He wasn't going to let Kirkland get away with his empty threats and lies. As the officer walked away, he called out after him, his voice echoing through the crowd. "You can run from accountability, Kirkland, but you can't hide from the truth. This town is done being silent." The crowd erupted into cheers. The sound of applause surged through the air, the energy of the protest shifting. Xavier could feel the weight of their support. But he knew it wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning. Later that evening, Xavier found himself standing in the dimly lit conference room, the weight of the day's events settling heavily on his shoulders. The protest had ended, but the consequences were just beginning to unfold. His phone buzzed constantly, his inbox filled with messages from reporters, activists, and even the city council, all demanding his next move. The tension from earlier in the day had only intensified, and Xavier knew that his actions had set something irreversible in motion. He ran a hand over his face, trying to gather his thoughts, when Mitchell entered the room. He was breathing heavily, clearly agitated. "You were right, Xavier," Mitchell said, pacing in frustration. "Kirkland is digging in. He's not going to just let this go." Xavier stood, his expression steely. "I know, but that's not going to stop me. He wants a fight, and I'm ready to give him one." Mitchell stopped pacing and looked directly at Xavier. "You're sure about this? About taking on the whole system? The board's not happy, and I'm getting word that the police are making moves to shut this investigation down before it even gets started." Xavier's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I didn't come this far to back down now. The people want change. I'm not going to let them down." Mitchell sighed, his face softening with a mixture of concern and respect. "You know this is going to get worse before it gets better, right? You've already made enemies of some powerful people." Xavier met his gaze with a quiet resolve. "If this is the fight I have to take on, then so be it. I didn't ask for this, but I'm not running from it. This town deserves better. Shaw Enterprises deserves better." Mitchell paused, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'm with you. Let's make sure we do it right." Just as Xavier began to process Mitchell's words, his phone buzzed again, this time with an alert that made his heart race. The headline read, "Police Chief Under Fire After Officer's Confrontation with Shaw Enterprises CEO." Xavier's eyes narrowed. The article was just the beginning. He knew this was going to escalate fast. There would be no more pretending the situation wasn't real. This was the moment everything would be laid bare. But there was still a part of him, small, quiet, that couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead would be much harder than he had imagined. The truth was out, but the fight had just begun. Xavier stood at the front of Shaw Enterprises, a deep breath filling his lungs as the protests had finally begun to slow, the crowd dispersing into smaller groups. The tension in the air was thick, too thick to ignore. He'd spent days preparing for this, but now that it was here, it was all-consuming. The media had arrived in full force, and the eyes of Meadowville and beyond were locked on him. The questions they had been asking him on social media, in phone calls, and even in person had grown louder, more insistent. What were his next steps? Was the system broken? And most crucially, could he make the change that the people so desperately needed? But Xavier wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the looming presence of Officer Kirkland. He had expected it, the retaliation, the challenge to his authority. What he didn't expect was how quickly the town would become a battleground for everyone, residents, police, activists, business owners. Caught between an unforgiving past and a challenging future, Xavier had made his stand, calling for justice, calling for the police to be held accountable. But this wasn't just about that one officer. This was about years of quiet discrimination that the people of Meadowville had suffered under, years of systemic bias, and a corrupt network that had protected itself at the cost of everyone else. He had been meeting with reporters when it happened. The office doors had burst open, and a storm of chaos followed Mitchell, who had been working with him through the storm of this situation, had just finished speaking with the mayor's office, when Officer Kirkland walked into the building, with his back straight and his eyes narrow. He wasn't alone. A few officers flanked him, their eyes cold and determined. They weren't there to be cooperative, to resolve things with respect. They were there to intimidate. "Mr. Shaw," Kirkland's voice was icy, cutting through the chatter in the room. "You've stirred up quite a mess. We need to talk." Xavier turned, steeling himself. He had seen that smug look too many times. "What's there to talk about, officer?" Xavier replied, his voice steady, though he could feel his blood simmering beneath the surface. "You've made your intentions clear. You want to silence me." Kirkland's eyes narrowed. "Oh, you think this is about me silencing you? You don't understand what you've done. You've painted every officer in Meadowville as a villain." He took a step closer, his stance aggressive, the hint of a threat hidden behind every word. "You've made it so that no one in this town can trust the police anymore. You've turned your back on the people who work hard every day to keep this town safe." Xavier's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about him standing up to Kirkland anymore. This was about a confrontation with the very foundation of a corrupt system, and Kirkland was just one cog in the machine. You think you can intimidate me with those words? Xavier took a step forward, closing the distance between them, keeping his voice low but resolute. This isn't about trust, Kirkland. This is about justice. People aren't just angry at you. They're angry at the system that's let you abuse your power unchecked for too long. Kirkland's eyes flashed with contempt, his hands now tightening into fists at his sides. And you think you're going to change that? You think you're going to fix everything by getting a few headlines? You're nothing, Shaw. Just a man with too much power and too little understanding of how things really work. The only thing you're accomplishing is making things worse. Xavier took another breath, his anger simmering beneath his calm demeanor. He was tired of the same words being thrown at him, the same tired excuses for years of failed leadership, the same men who continued to hold people like him down, afraid of change. I've spent my life building something that works for everyone, Kirkland. Not just the few. And you know what I'm done playing by your rules. Xavier's voice rose, the frustration he had been holding back spilling over. People are going to know who you are. People are going to understand the kind of man you are. You're not a protector, Kirkland. You're part of the problem. The air grew heavier between them, the atmosphere thick with tension. Xavier's heart raced as Kirkland's eyes narrowed into slits, his lip curling in a cruel smile. You think this is a game? You think that just because you have some fancy title, you can come in here and change everything. You're just like the rest of them, nothing but a rich, entitled businessman who thinks he can push everyone around. But you're wrong. You can't do it. Not here, not with me. Xavier's mind raced, the raw anger bubbling just beneath the surface. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was a fight. He had been fighting for the better part of his life. Fighting for fairness, fighting for the people who had been discarded, fighting for those who never had a voice. But today, with Kirkland standing before him, that fight had reached a boiling point. You're right about one thing, Xavier said, his voice quiet now, but firm, every word hitting like a hammer. You can't change me, but that's not the problem. The problem is that you think you can keep pushing people around, and they'll keep tolerating it. That's where you're wrong. And if you think you can intimidate me into silence, you've made a grave mistake. Kirkland opened his mouth, ready to say something more, but before he could, a loud knock on the door interrupted the moment. The door swung open, and there stood Chief Harrington, flanked by a few of his senior officers. What's going on here? Harrington's voice was thick with the same sense of arrogance that had filled the room moments before. Xavier didn't back down. He stood tall, unwavering, staring straight at Kirkland, before turning his attention to the chief. What's going on here is that your officers are abusing their power. Your officers are making things worse, and I'm not going to let it continue. This isn't just one arrest. It's the systemic corruption that's been festering in this town for years. Harrington's face twisted into a scowl. What are you talking about, Shaw? You're trying to turn everyone against us. Xavier's jaw clenched. No, Harrington. I'm trying to turn people towards justice. And you. He pointed at both men, his finger trembling slightly with frustration. You've allowed this system to thrive. You've allowed officers like Kirkland to treat people like criminals just because of the color of their skin. The room fell silent, the reality of Xavier's words sinking in. Kirkland glared at Xavier, but his fists were now clenched at his sides, a clear sign of the tension that was about to snap. You think you're the only one who's been wronged, Shaw? Kirkland spat, his voice rising with the anger now boiling in his veins. You think your life is the only one that matters? Xavier stepped forward again, his eyes locked onto Kirkland's. I never said that. But I am saying this. I'm done letting people like you destroy this town. You've been allowed to operate without consequence for too long, and it's time for that to end. The room seemed to close in around them, the eyes of every person in the room focused on Xavier, and the officers. Xavier could feel the weight of the moment, the way it shifted everything. There was no going back now. The stakes had never been higher, and he knew the decision to confront these men would forever change the course of his life. As the tension reached its peak, Kirkland finally snapped, his voice rising with rage. You'll regret this, Shaw. You've just crossed a line you can never come back from. You think you can change anything. You're nothing. But Xavier, standing tall in the face of all of it, knew he had already won. The crowd outside, the people of Meadowville, had spoken. They had chosen sides. The battle was no longer just between him and Officer Kirkland, it was between the forces of justice and those determined to keep the status quo. And no matter what came next, Xavier knew one thing for sure: he would never back down. Xavier sat in the office of Shaw Enterprises, the hum of the morning rush filtering through the windows, his thoughts drifting to the meeting he'd just concluded. The tension that had been building for days had finally reached a boiling point. He had confronted Officer Kirkland, and the heat of their exchange had set the stage for the next chapter. What had once been an intimate battle for justice had become a larger issue, one that involved the town, its institutions, and everyone who had ever been silenced by the systemic corruption Xavier was now determined to expose. But even as he sat there, his mind racing, the realization dawned that there was still much to be done. The truth hadn't been fully revealed yet, and though he had won a small victory by standing up to Kirkland and calling him out in front of everyone, that was just the beginning. The morning after the confrontation, Xavier had called a press conference, knowing that the media would be waiting for his next move. The decision to make this public wasn't an easy one, but it was necessary. If there was going to be any hope for systemic change, the people of Meadowville had to see the reality for what it was. As expected, the crowd was vast, the reporters eager to get the latest update on the investigation into Kirkland's actions. They asked all the usual questions: whether Xavier was still committed to pursuing justice, whether the investigation had uncovered anything new. But Xavier wasn't just answering questions anymore. He was making a statement. "This town is ready for change," Xavier had said, standing tall at the podium, his voice unwavering. "It's not just about me anymore, it's about the people who have been silenced for far too long. The injustice we've all witnessed has reached a tipping point. It's time to hold those accountable who have long thought they were above reproach." The weight of his words hung in the air, and the crowd fell silent, absorbing the implications of what Xavier was saying. In that moment, he realized that the people who had once questioned him, doubted his motives, were beginning to see the truth. This was bigger than his fight with Kirkland. It was about a broader, systemic issue that needed to be addressed if real change was ever going to take place. But just as the press conference came to an end, the sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted his thoughts. Xavier turned to see Mitchell entering, a look of concern on his face. "Xavier," Mitchell said, closing the door behind him. "You did it. You made the statement, but I'm afraid things are escalating faster than we thought. The police department is doubling down." Xavier frowned, the weight of Mitchell's words sinking in. "What do you mean?" "Not only are they refusing to back down, but they're actively fighting the investigation. Chief Harrington has been making statements to the press, claiming that the whole thing is politically motivated. He's calling it a smear campaign, and they've already started rallying support from conservative groups in town. People are picking sides, and it's getting ugly." Xavier leaned back in his chair, his fingers pressing against his temple as he processed the news. He had expected resistance, but hearing it from Mitchell's mouth made it real. The fight was no longer just a matter of exposing one officer's actions. It was about dismantling the entrenched power structure that had allowed that officer to act with impunity for so long. "I knew it wouldn't be easy," Xavier muttered. "But we've already made progress. The people are starting to see the truth. This town can't keep pretending it's immune to the same issues everyone else is facing." Mitchell nodded. "That's true, but we need to be ready. The backlash is going to get worse. People are already protesting in front of City Hall, and if they feel like the investigation is being stifled, it's going to get ugly." Xavier's mind began to race again, his thoughts jumping from one idea to the next. He had to stay focused, had to figure out how to navigate the storm that was coming. He couldn't afford to lose momentum. Not now, not after everything they had fought for. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him out of his thoughts, a text message from the mayor's office. He read it quickly. "Xavier, we need to talk, urgent." He stood up immediately, the sudden sense of urgency overtaking him. "I need to go to City Hall," he said to Mitchell, who nodded in agreement. As Xavier walked toward the door, he knew that this meeting would be crucial. The mayor had already shown her support, but now they had to make sure the momentum didn't die. The battle had only begun, and if they didn't act fast, the resistance could turn into something far worse than he had anticipated. When Xavier arrived at City Hall, the scene was tense. Officers in uniform stood by the entrance, their eyes scanning the crowd, but the protesters were no longer just a small group. They had grown. People from all walks of life were here, standing together in solidarity, demanding justice. Xavier walked past them, his mind set on the meeting with the mayor. Inside, the mood was different. The staff in City Hall moved with purpose, but there was an underlying sense of apprehension. As Xavier entered the mayor's office, she looked up at him from her desk, her face hard with determination. She was ready for this fight. But even she knew it would be a long, difficult road ahead. "Xavier, I'm glad you're here," Mayor Walker said, her voice steady. "I've been getting pressure from all sides. The council is hesitant, but they're starting to listen. We need to keep pushing. We can't let the system shut us down." Xavier nodded, his gaze firm. "I agree. We've come too far to turn back now. We have the support of the people, and that's what matters most. But we need to expose what's been happening. The corruption, the abuse of power. We have to keep pushing the narrative. Get people to see the truth." Mayor Walker leaned forward, her expression hardening. "We're talking about systemic corruption that runs deep, Xavier. This isn't just about one officer or one department. It's about everything. The entire town has been complicit for too long. And we both know that the only way to stop this is to hold everyone accountable. But that won't happen without a fight." Xavier met her gaze, his resolve clear. "I'm ready for that fight. We won't back down." The mayor's eyes softened for a moment. "I know you are, but be prepared. This isn't going to be easy. The whole town is going to change, and there will be pushback. There will be people who will try to tear this apart, and they'll use every trick they can to keep things the way they've always been." Xavier felt a surge of frustration. "I know. But they're the ones who've kept this system in place, and we're the ones who will tear it down." Just as Xavier spoke those words, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Mitchell. "We need to move fast. The council is about to make a move. They're going to try and derail everything. You need to get to the meeting room." Xavier's stomach dropped as he stood. "I'll meet you there," he said to the mayor. "It's time to take this to the next level." Inside the council meeting room, the tension was palpable. The seats were filled with council members, most of them wearing expressions of frustration. Mayor Walker stood by Xavier's side, the weight of their shared mission resting on both of them. The door opened, and Xavier stepped forward. The room fell silent as he made his way to the podium. The stakes were clear. This wasn't just about a single protest. This wasn't even just about Meadowville. This was about the future. The country was watching. They couldn't afford to fail. Xavier cleared his throat, his voice calm, but filled with a quiet power. "We are here because the people of this town deserve justice. They deserve to know that they are not invisible, that they are not disposable. And it's time that the systems which have failed them be held accountable." There was a pause, the weight of his words hanging in the air, but Xavier wasn't finished. "I'm asking for a full investigation into not just Officer Kirkland, but the system that allowed him to act with impunity. We can no longer stand by and pretend that this is an isolated incident. This is just the beginning of a larger issue that needs to be addressed." As he spoke, a voice interrupted. "You're trying to tear this town apart. This is too much too soon," said one of the conservative council members, his voice tinged with anger. Xavier met his gaze, unwavering. "What's too much is waiting for change to happen. The people won't wait anymore, and neither will I." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. The resistance had started to crack. As the meeting continued, Xavier could feel the tide beginning to shift. The hard truths were undeniable, and though not everyone in the room was on board yet, some were starting to ask themselves the same questions. But Xavier knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.